Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another important episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. Again, it is November 7th, 2019. We're live streaming and recording from Kirkland, Washington, very close to my former home in Issaquah, Washington, where I used to work for Microsoft. And we are here to interview Mike Brown. We are continuing in our interview with Mike Brown. We just spent several hours hearing about Mike's story, how he was raised in the church, served a mission, how Mike eventually got married in the temple, and served was living the Mormon dream with his wife and young kids until in around 2015, he started studying church history and studying Mormon Truth Claims in depth, and experienced kind of the rabbit hole faith crisis himself, which went into full bloom in 2016, which led Mike to start writing some essays. And Mike has written over 30 essays dealing in depth with church history and Mormon truth claims, but more importantly, trying to write some content that would be enough information, enough objective, honest, factual information so that people who want to be informed can be, but at the same time, not too much so that they're overwhelmed or bored. And he's made his own very important contribution to Mormon truth, Mormon awareness. That is a wonderful accompaniment to Jeremy Rundle's CES letter, to Mormon Think, to Letter to My Wife, and to all the other wonderful resources out there. But if you go to mormonstories.org and you click on the Truth Claims menu item, you have this huge list of 30 essays that are wonderful resources to understand the church's truth claims better. And also there's this amazing chronology there, which provides a chronology from, the times, sort of Lehi and Jerusalem times, 600 BC, all the way through to modern day. A huge, wonderful chronology to help you put the Mormon church's history in context. And it's a great resource. We had a wonderful several-hour discussion. We had a really large group joining us on Facebook Live. We really appreciated that. And we broke for lunch and bathroom breaks, and now we're back. And we're going to spend another at least 3.5 hours going deep in Mormon church history. So far, we've covered Joseph Smith's treasure digging. We have covered maybe Joseph Smith's reputation as, sort of his character. We've covered that. And we talked again about both Book of Mormon translation and Joseph's history as a treasure digger. And it's now time to move on to other things.
Cool.
So Mike Brown, first of all, welcome back to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thanks again.
What do you want to explore next for our listeners?
Well, why don't we talk about the first vision, and then we'll move from there through Book of Mormon and priesthood, and kind of hit the high points.
And I think it's really important that we cover the treasure digging before the first vision. Do you want to tell our listeners why that's important?
Well, now we covered that, and do you want to cover it some more, or
why
did we? Yeah.
Why chronologically?
Yeah. Well, it all started with the treasure digging.
Do we cover the first vision after the treasure digging? You'd think, no, wait a minute.
Right.
Joseph had his first vision. He saw God. God told him to start the one true church.
Right.
And then the treasure digging was sort of this sort of unfortunate side thing that happened before he got back to starting God's one true church.
Yeah.
But it may not be quite like that.
Well, I follow the actual chronology of events, and that's something we learn too, as you follow the documentable history of what was occurring when and who ever heard or said what. Everything started with, well, even back up further, the family's history of struggling and relocating. And, I found it fascinating when the family lost their land and their house they had built because Joe Sr. and Jr. were both off on a treasure dig, and they lost their house. It all started with the treasure digging, and that was their means of employment. But again, that's pretty well documented. as we segue into the first vision, I think...
and it's okay. You may get to this, but the reason why I just set that up for you is because there's evidence that the first vision there's no evidence that the first vision actually happened at the time he claimed it did. He didn't tell anyone about it.
Right.
And it's almost like the first vision story actually was created later and then retrofitted back to help give a more spiritual context to the treasure digging stuff that happened before.
Well, it's not.
And that's why chronologically it comes after.
Yeah,
I
agree.
Before.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I was saying. It's not like it was retrofitted. It was retrofitted. So I didn't know any of this either. And during the break, you and I were chatting about the chronology, and I hadn't recounted this story in a while to anyone. So it was a reminder to me how, fairly recent this has all been, even for me, where, my trajectory was changing a little bit 3 and 4 years ago, where I had a lot of dissonance and I couldn't figure out why some of these things didn't add up. But I had no context. I didn't have enough information to make sense of it. It's only been in the last 2 years that I've dug in and truly dug deep and figured this stuff out. But yeah, what I would suggest with the actual chronology that can be documented is it's more illustrative to consider what's not there, what there's no record of, what should be there. And so we'll jump into that. But that to me, as I looked into things, was nobody was talking about any vision. The family never heard about any vision. When Joseph started talking about it many years later, they were actually confused. They thought it was the treasure guardian or the treasure angel, or an angel appeared. So they were even confused. And you can go all the way back and look at when Joseph's mother, many decades later, wrote her, book about Joseph. She didn't even include the first vision at all. Was it Parley Pratt had to insert that? Anyway, we can cover that. But yeah, I think Orson Pratt later inserted it because nobody was talking about it literally until decades later. Yeah, but yeah, anyway, how that ties in with treasure digging is. They thought he was talking about the treasure guardian that, surprised him and wouldn't let him have the treasure. But yeah, the first vision, though, I do think that's kind of a whole topic unto itself.
Let's talk about it.
All right. So basically...
I think the most important thing is what you just said, that there's no evidence of him ever writing down or telling anyone that it happened at the time.
Well, I think there's actually evidence that shows he clearly didn't. It's not just that there's no evidence, it's that all the evidence indicates he was doing other things.
Yeah,
and talking about other things, and
the first recorded evidence of it is in 1832, which is 12 years after, plus or minus a year or two, where it actually
20. So it's supposed to have occurred in 1820, right?
Right, and then 32 is the first version.
Well, but no one knew about that. Right. So 32 was the first handwritten sort of note of, well, I kind of saw the Lord. No God, no Father, no Satan, no battling. It was just. And that we should talk about here later. The first draft, if you will, of sort of seeing the Lord was 1832. But he didn't tell anybody. Nobody even knew about that. That was discovered 100 years later in a box in Salt Lake that had come across the plains. And Joseph Fielding Smith was, I believe, the church historian at the time, and cut the thing out. He cut it out of the journal and hid it in his personal safe. That's disputed. You can't prove it, but really, all the contextual evidence says he was the guy that took it out and wouldn't give anybody access. It's on the essays. Did you make me change the title? I had Thank God for Tape, remember? Because he cellophane taped it back into the journal.
Yeah, and by the way, we're interviewing RFM Reform
Radio Free Mormon.
Radio Free Mormon tomorrow. He's got a great episode on Joseph Fielding Smith.
Yeah.
Cutting out the page that gives the original account of the first vision, hiding it for decades.
It was so troublesome.
And then
it didn't align with the narrative. He just cut it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would call that the first sort of draft, but nobody had heard of the first vision in the United States until 1842. That was 22 years-ish after the purported event. And I found it fascinating that we still, not that Joseph has to tell us everything, but he doesn't know the date of when it occurred. The spring of 1820, right?
One of the of the, we all know about multiple versions. Most of us know about multiple versions of the first vision. One of the differences between the versions is when it happened.
Yeah.
Sometimes he's 15, sometimes he's 14.
Right. He's 16 and the age of his... Well, and you're introducing a lot there, because I would back up a step further. So I would start with the burned over district in New York. It was called the burned over district in upstate New York because it was so evangelical, and the fervor, and everybody was seeing God and having visions. And, some years later, the, Jehovah's Witnesses, and was it the Seventh-day Adventists that, started up in that region? Other churches with visionary prophets and things. But there are, and it's on the website, there are other visions that were recorded that are remarkably similar to what Joseph eventually wrote, and the light and, the brightness above my head, and all these things are remarkably similar. And they were the visions of other people at the same time that were talking and having many accounts predating Joseph Smith.
And the point there is just, it was totally commonplace. Joseph would have heard about others having visions. Yeah. And then his vision would have sort of been viewed by many around him as just like, join the club. Yeah. Lots of people are having visions. Yeah. And like you say, so much of the phraseology that he describes in his vision, you could trace it coming almost directly from accounts of other people having visions. So it was it was common to claim to have visions.
So everybody was having visions, remarkably similar to the language Joseph ended up consolidating and using and adapting, and each one grew. So and then there's different versions of the visions over time. They grew more elaborate and grandiose. I mean, in the beginning, there was I sort of saw the Lord. And by the time he's done, he saw, the Lord and God, and he's battling Satan for his very life. And it was just this big thing. But the versions in between contradict, as you mentioned, how old was he and what were his motivations and reason. There's a chart on the website. It's a little hard to tell. If you click on it, it'll expand up into the PDF, and you can see, and thank you to whoever came up with that. I did not make that. But it's a comparative chart that shows the differences. And the apologists pretty much adopt the suggestion that nothing to see here. They all complement or supplement each other. I did not find that to be the case, and I'm pretty sure if I saw God, I would remember when, even if I maybe didn't feel compelled to tell people. Okay, but the inconsistencies there. For me, the biggest issue was learning that absolutely nobody was talking about. Let me give you some examples. His own family records, and there are many, indicate they were confused. They didn't know what he was talking about when he started years later introducing this notion of seeing God. But in 1834, Mormonism Unveiled, was that E.D. Howe or whatever, Ebert or Edbert, whatever. He went around and solicited opinions, and basically this was the first anti-Mormon literature, right? And this was the dirt on Mormonism, and so you can go online and read the whole thing, but there's absolutely no mention of any seeing God or first vision. And if anybody would have been picking on Joseph Smith for his crazy ideas and treasure, all the other things they picked on him for in there, zero mention of any seeing God, because nobody in 1834, that Mormonism Unveiled absolutely would have mentioned it and criticized it had it been a thing. And then the next year, 1835, Joseph Smith himself worked directly with Oliver Cowdery to produce what was called it was an account of early church beginnings. So even Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith in 1835 didn't mention any first vision. And this is when they were cobbling together and editing the Book of Commandments into the D&C and inserting alterations and all kinds of other problems. But even then, they weren't mentioning they'd ever seen God. 1837, and I'm just pulling a few of the many, many points on the chronology that to me say they shoulda, coulda, woulda been talking about seeing God had Joseph said it to anybody. But the early decades of the church had absolutely no discussion of any first vision.
And going back, his family have no recollection of him ever telling anyone. Now, of course, an apologetic response may be, well, he's humble about it.
Sure. Too
God
sacred.
told him to keep it sacred because it's so special.
Right.
And I guess you're
well, I'm saying
wondering.
It's not just that they weren't talking about it; it's that when he did talk about it, they were confused and said, "What were you talking about? The angel, the treasure guardian?" I mean,
it's Nephi. Was it Moroni? Was it?
the names changed, and in certain documents it was Moroni, and then later it changed to Nephi because that made more, or vice versa, right?
Yeah, Nephi then Moroni.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1837 even, Parley P. Pratt published A Voice of Warning. That was a big pamphlet that went through Europe because they were starting to campaign in Europe. No mention of first vision. So the chronology contains a lot of, and I tried to bold those where you could see no mention of first vision. I mean, I'm criticized for that a little bit because it comes off as negative, but I think it's massively important to document what wasn't there, And so for me, that was big to learn. Okay, so again, I mentioned earlier, if there were just one issue in this campaign of the narrative, we could bypass that. But basically, the first vision for me was one of those very tipping points that maybe this treasure digger supernatural guy, and that's before we get into the Book of Mormon and how that was composed and the material. I think it all ties together that maybe it didn't happen when or how we thought.
So what's your theory about the first vision then? Do you have a theory? Did he just make it up later?
Well, I think he embellished and made it all more grandiose, and each telling got more and more beneficial. And you have to look at the chronology of when he started introducing this. He was under heavy criticism. His authority was being challenged. Was this
by Kirtland?
I'd have to check their chronology.
38-ish, I heard.
No, that was. He was basically in a position of wanting to shore up his authority, and this is when the same thing happened when he introduced the priesthood. His position was being challenged, and it was, and by the way, I received this special authority. No one had heard of that for 5 years either. So there's this trend consistent with the first vision and the priesthood restoration. We don't know where or when it occurred exactly. Although we know the sacred grove, we know where, but we don't know when. We don't know where or when for the priesthood restoration, and no one heard of that for 5 years either. So there's kind of a trend of potential embellishment. And when we get to the priesthood section later, Richard Bushman wrote the comment that the latter introduction of these events lends itself to potential fabrication or something there. I'll quote from him later, or even he acknowledged that it just sort of appeared later at a fairly convenient time for Joseph in his career path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a chance that he remembered having some type of experience as a boy, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I honestly, I think and this is just my opinion, I think Joseph was a believer in his, pious spirituality abilities that, otherwise, why would he go take the first presidency to dig for treasure under a house, in Salem? I think he was a fantastical genius. Joseph was a genius at what he was doing, but he did believe in a lot of what he was up to. That doesn't make it true. It just means he believed it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a lot of theories on that, but yeah. And I just try to stick to connecting the hard points and the dots of what wasn't known when did it appear. I mean, you can draw your own conclusions following the evidence, and then you can fill in the gaps with faith of, anything can be patched over with that.
And so for me, the essential parts of the first vision are: it appears super late. There's different accounts. It changes over time. It evolves. The accounts of the first vision evolve with his own changing theology.
Totally,
so coincidentally,
the nature of God,
as he moves from God and Jesus and the Holy Ghost being one, which incidentally is in the Book of Mormon, to a theology that God and Jesus are separate and that we can become God someday, he's got to move both the Book of Mormon and the first vision to be in sync with his new theology.
Right.
So he literally changes the Book of Mormon to sync up with that theology, and he evolves his first vision story.
Yeah.
That's all problematic. And then the final problematic thing is that the church intentionally hid this from us for decades, including Joseph Fielding Smith ripping the original first vision account out of one of Joseph's notebooks and hiding it in a safe for decades until Sandra Tanner and others revealed that there was a secret hidden version of the first vision account. And then Joseph Fielding Smith tapes it back into the book. And there all of a sudden we have it to see. That shows known, explicit active deception of the
It's
members
ironic, isn't it?
by the church historian who eventually becomes one of the presidents or prophets of the church.
Yeah, well, it's ironic that the most, rabid, Gerald and Sandra calling you rabid anti-Mormons, but those that are accused of being the most anti-Mormon are the ones that want our original materials, released and discussed and visible, and the church does not want their seer stones and their altered documents. They very much fought that for generations.
Right.
And, again, that speaks to the credibility of kind of what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
There's a quote, this is worth sharing. So when I was in my search, lest anybody think I was really just trying to tear this all down, I actually gave these people money, A Reason for Faith. This is Laura Hales, right? That was the editor of this. This is a book that is intended, to help faithful members stay faithful and reconcile by chapter a lot of these points. You've got the first vision, you've got women, race in the priesthood, Freemasonry. Okay. Well, this, again, at this point in my journey now, I'm highlighting, I'm taking notes, but I thought, surely there's a piece of the puzzle I'm just missing that'll make this fit. And I think this book occurred during that time. But what they're telling me here in their explanation of why there's different versions and they contradict and it doesn't align. Composing the 1832 narrative required a different type of memory retrieval. He composed the 1832 document in an act of intentional, explicit remembering, which required a systematic search of memory known as strategic retrieval. Unsolicited cue rather than, and it goes on to talk about two unique memories of the same event, each formed when different kinds of cues activate different pieces of past stored in different parts of Joe's brain. And I wrote on this, this struck me as like really associative retrieval and just different parts of the brain being engaged. I mean, this book did more damage to my faith than any of the so-called because the mental gymnastics that they're asking us to follow of why someone couldn't remember seeing God struck me as irreconcilable. But again, that's just my opinion. But the words used by the apologetics to paste over what actually occurred didn't work for me. And this struck me as really, really desperate. The act of explicitly remembering and, strategic retrieval versus systematic search. Like, really? Is that what it's come to? Is that where we're at? I don't know. That's just me. But yeah, the apologetics that explain these first visions are, I found them difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. I found it disappointing. I mean, honestly, this was a big piece. If there was no first vision, but it ties in. You got to look at the priesthood too. And we want to get to that soon, right? You got to look at the priesthood efficacy and does it really work? Is it powerful? Is there power of discernment? Are healthcare outcomes dramatically different if you rub olive oil on a person's head? It all ties together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what comes after first vision?
All right. Well, so first vision, is its own little, can of worms that you can explore at your leisure. The Book of Mormon though, right? So the Book of Mormon now is really, on my mission, I read that once front to back in 2 weeks. I just devoured it. I've read it numerous times. I was really into it. The stories and the wars and the Captain Moroni's and all the things we pull out of that. I definitely, there were times in my life when I found it really inspiring and I read it and I get that people I get why people get stuff out of it. But I also really wanted to know, how could this book come about? If Joseph Smith turns out not to be who he claimed to be, what is this book and where did it come from? And we were raised on a narrative that no, simple farm boy could have possibly created this super complex work, right? It turns out, though, that everything about the Book of Mormon is basically just common talk of the early 1800s and the Indian removals and the gathering of Israel, and the natives, needed the white Christians to redeem them. And it goes deeper and deeper into this. You can look online now and see side-by-side comparisons of these different works of the day. the late war, View of the Hebrews. It's all there on
War of Napoleon.
The late war. Yeah. There's so much there that you look at it. The Stripling Warriors, and I've got it on here. I've got notes, but the late war, is it came to pass in the 2000 Stripling Warriors, curious workmanship, rod of iron, elephants in America, cataclysmic earthquake followed by great darkness. God will favor and protect America if the inhabitants remain faithful. Does that ring a bell? I mean, all of these works of the day, but I would go back. I would go back to View of the Hebrews, which I'd never heard of that. I'd never heard of B.H. Roberts, B.H.'s study of all this stuff, which is fascinating.
He was a general authority in the mid-1900s, early to mid-1900s, who sort of loved science, and so he did his own investigation of the Book of Mormon, and he candidly told the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 that the Book of Mormon was deeply problematic from a scientific perspective, and its historicity was in significant doubt. And of course, the church.
Oh, it's a fascinating. I made a whole page on him. And he presented to the apostles that asked him to do the study, and so But the View of the Hebrews is fascinating because Ethan Smith was a minister. And Pulteney, Vermont, or New York, or wherever that was. And Oliver Cowdery, his family attended Ethan's congregation. And Ethan Smith, I'm going to pull it out over here because what I'm going to suggest about View of the Hebrews, it gets dismissed a lot as no, this isn't relevant. And the reason that people think it's not relevant, and I'm just going to hold this up. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. You can print it off now online. It's 112 pages of this kind of font. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. It's mind-numbingly small, and it's terribly written. It's just a terrible piece of work. It's just rambling, and people try to read this and see, was this the framework of the Book of Mormon? And it's so poorly written, and it's such a mess that it's easy to dismiss. But what you have to pull out from this was everybody was talking about the Indians and the tribes, and I consolidated 112 pages of nonsense into, and I'm going to skim this quick but let me just see if this rings a bell, John. And this is actually quotes directly from View of the Hebrews in the order that they appeared throughout this rambling work. Rejection of Jesus Christ, O Jerusalem, killest the prophets, destruction of Jerusalem, a prophet ascends the walls, woe unto this city, while arrows are shot at him. Samuel the Lamanite, right? Natives of our country are outcasts of Israel. They've lost their way, bewildered in darkness. The prophet Isaiah is of deep interest to America. All descend from one stock, scattered into different tribes, falling from the purity in a language. Knowledge of mechanical arts, navigation was lost. Implements of iron and metals and tokens of improvement. Indians having descended from the 10 tribes. Talks about iron, blah, blah, blah. They became wholly separated from the hunting and savage tribes of their brethren. And the more civilized part continued for many centuries, and there were tremendous wars between them, the savage brethren, until the former became extinct. And the savage tribes prevailed, annihilated their more civilized brethren. This accounts for the loss of their letters and language, navigation, iron, blah, blah, blah. The people of Israel came into the western continent. Anyway, it became extinct under the rage of their more numerous savage brethren. It talks about forts, mounds, civil improvements, articles dug from the old mounds. And then the other group was struggling to maintain their existence and to maintain their religious traditions. It talks about walled towns, forts, temples, altars, chieftains, watchtowers, military works. An old Indian informed him that his fathers in this country had a book which they for a long time had preserved. And they buried it, and they preserved these fragments for the better days with utmost care. Blah, blah, blah. It was buried and providently transmitted to us. Some modern Jew left it there in a situation where it was found on Indian Hill underground, a book which they could not read. And the great and generous Christian people, of course, the white people that were pushing the Indians off their land, are the best prepared to ameliorate their condition, bringing them to the knowledge and order of God. Anyway, this just goes on and on. It's the entire framework of the Book of Mormon, this notion. But you can't hardly find this through all the nonsense of the rambling, but it's literally the whole framework. And that's been the accusation for almost 200 years, was that the framework, the ideas of the day all came from known works that were available to Joseph Smith through just common reading and libraries and sources of the day.
And is that the sources of inspiration and content section in your essays?
Yeah, even the Liahona, you can see, partly made of brass, curious works. It looked like a clock and a ball. I mean, that's all from the late war. The Liahona and all these things are like side by side coming from the works of the day. But yeah, I found it a lot easier to actually reconcile the sources of it's not direct copying, but it's basically a retelling and a rehashing of basically what was available in the day.
And that's one of the tricks that apologists play is they'll say, well, just read View of the Hebrews. It doesn't read anything like the Book of Mormon.
It's terrible.
And that's true. It's an awful read.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have a narrative in the same type of way, the same type of character development.
Like the late war does.
What they do is they erect the straw man, which is like, well, it's not plagiarism.
Right.
It's not word for word plagiarism because clearly the words, the structures, the prose in the View of the Hebrews or the late war or whatever doesn't match the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
But that's not the point, because it's not just View of the Hebrews. There are other books written, in addition to the late war, and in addition to others, all this stuff about Native Americans and Israelites and buried stuff and treasure and wars and lore about Native Americans. That was just the cultural context. It was like Kardashians now.
Yeah, it was American exceptionalism.
It was the way we were justifying kicking the Indians off their land, killing them, torturing them.
It was God's will.
It had to be God's will, but we also, read in the Bible where the 12 tribes, maybe the Indians somehow descended from, maybe that's how we can figure out where the 12 tribes went in the Bible. And it wasn't just View of the Hebrews. It was everywhere in the culture. Yeah. And for me, the book Losing a Lost Tribe by Simon Southerton was a really important book that I read here in Seattle way back in the early 2000s, which does a good job of covering this. Okay. And of course, Grant Palmer talks a lot about this type of stuff in in Insider's View of Mormon Origins.
Read that one.
And so
he goes even further. People criticize, was the Golden Pot really source or not? But the reality is, I wanted to know if early American Indians were really writing this, about Christ is coming and be afraid and all these things, or did it really sound a lot more like the early 1800s and exactly what they were talking and falling down and shaking and revivaling? It sounds a lot more like the 1800s.
Yeah. And the fact that all the theological debates in the Book of Mormon. Where does authority come from?
Nature of God.
Right? Yeah. What's the nature of God? What's the proper type of baptism? Yeah. There's no evidence that Mesoamerican Native Americans in 600 AD were thinking or talking about this stuff, because there's no evidence of any talk about Jesus. Yeah. And why would it make sense anyway that Native Americans are allowed to know about Jesus and talk about Jesus and debate about baptism and authority when Jews themselves, the literal, predecessors of Jesus, weren't allowed to know Jesus' name or didn't know about baptism and didn't know about resurrection, didn't know about any of this stuff. That just is a huge screaming red flag that there's something seriously wrong.
And no sooner did, in the narrative, they disembarked this boat that they invented transoceanic navigation and came across the ocean, and then promptly lost that ability, of course, because boats are never mentioned again. Is they immediately start, worshiping in a Christian manner to Jesus, but there's no mention of any of their Jewish tradition and heritage and, burnt offerings and all the things that Jewish holidays and celebrations, because it says they maintain their Jewish heritage, Hebrew heritage, while they also did this Christian thing. I mean, it's just, there's more to it. I mean, for me, I can move past this stuff pretty quick because it's self-evident and you either believe it or you don't. But that gets you to Deutero-Isaiah and the problems with Isaiah. and the King James errors copied straight into the text. And then apologists often say, well, out of respect for the Bible and its purity, he just copied that. But, the rest of it's translation. And you're like, well, so did he use other texts of his day or didn't he? Because that's a really important question.
And we cover a lot of this with Dan Vogel, but also with Brent Metcalf and also with David Bacavoy. Go back and check out those interviews on Mormon Stories.
Yeah.
But like you said, for those who don't know, there are parts of the Old Testament that were written after Lehi left Jerusalem. That's what he means by Deutero-Isaiah.
Right. And
there's no way that could appear in the Book of Mormon if it hadn't been written yet to be incorporated into the brass plates that Lehi and Nephi, that Laban died for, and that Lehi and Nephi brought over.
Yeah.
Well, how did they get included? Plus, there are errors from the King James Version of the Bible that Joseph Smith had, italices, etc., that were incorporated into the actual text of the Book of Mormon. Why would errors from the version of the King James Version of the Bible that Joseph had be appearing in Scripture that was supposedly written by God and His prophets and then translated, through Joseph Smith? It just and then there are all the anachronisms. So not just Deuteronomy.
Oh, yeah, there's a whole laundry list of issues.
So do you have an essay on those?
Oh yeah, they're in there. Yeah, the anachronisms. There's scriptural anachronisms, like how would they have known Christ's name before Christianity and the Jews knew his name, but whatever, all things are possible. But then there's the the archaeological anachronisms, which we're going to get into next. Things, elephants and horses and chariots and things. Steel,
wheat, barley.
Yeah, and apologetics desperately to, try to provide the hole, fill the holes. And, you can go for that if you want, but there are things there that just didn't exist, and never mind that there's absolutely no evidence in the old world or the new that people were writing on thin metal sheets of copper, brass, gold, anything, it's just not credible. But it's there. The anachronisms, I just never thought about it. I grew up on these art pictures of, the swords and the super jacked up white Indians, that lift weights a lot and, they look good, and I saw the
Arnold
images.
Freeberg.
Oh yeah. Right.
For those who are new to Mormon Stories, check out the Michael Coe interviews, COE.
Right.
Michael Coe is a famous Yale archaeologist who just passed away a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
But I did an interview with him back in 2011, 2012.
Right.
Was the world's expert in Mesoamerican history and archaeology and anthropology right during the time of the Book of Mormon, who happened to have taken interest in Mormonism.
Yeah.
And he goes through and talks about the likelihood or the probability that the Book of Mormon is what it claims to be from a scientific perspective. And he's careful to point out it's not just what the book's including that it shouldn't include, steel, horses, barley, wheat, but it's what it leaves out.
Exactly.
There should be jaguars, there should be chocolate,
dogs.
There should be all sorts of animals and food that isn't there.
Yeah.
They're eating European food,
right.
which was the same food, ironically, that Joseph Smith had access to in the early 1800s. Right. But they're not eating actual Native American food like maize and tomatoes and
we just can't know, John.
And chocolate.
Yeah, we just don't know
because Joseph didn't know what the Native Americans were eating, and so anyway, there are huge problems.
Well, and then we're gonna the archaeology, I think, is a fascinating part. But let's look at the printing of the book too. And this was let me tell you. Well, there's a story around that, but to be brief, basically, I found this part fascinating. The printing of the book, and there's a page, a little essay on that about how it came about and how Martin Harris was engaged and leveraged to part with his farm and put up the collateral, and who was going to commit to selling what, and was it 50-50? And there's just a lot to that. I think one of your listeners asked you earlier mentioned a question about selling the copyright. Is that still?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So at one point, when Joseph was trying to raise the money to print the book, he hatched the revelation to go and send representatives to the Toronto area to sell the rights to the book. And I'm thinking of all the miracles wrought God can touch rocks and make them shine for your boat that's going to bob across the ocean. And it's the super awesome miracles that occurred, but he couldn't come up with a better idea than selling the most pure and important book of the Restoration.
The copyright, the ownership of the intellectual property.
That one never sat with me, and never really made sense. Of course, nobody bought the copyright. But anyway, so then he gets into this sales contract with Martin Harris, and that's all in the record too. It's one of the slides, but you really don't even need to pull it up, I guess. But
let's pull it up.
All right. Well, it's this handwritten note for authorizing Martin Harris to equal rights to sell the book it's these kinds of things that are in the record, which by itself, this doesn't have to be a controversial piece, but it ties in and fits with a very different narrative than the one we were taught. And
tell us what this document is.
So this document is and there's more to it. Again, it's in the essays. But I had fun writing or compiling that essay on the printing because there's just so much more of a rich context around what actually happened and how did Martin Harris actually get talked into putting up his. So I'll go through it briefly. But basically, Martin Harris got threatened with never-ending, eternal, everlasting destruction and pain and suffering if he didn't part with his land. And then they warned him not to covet his neighbor's wife because rumor had it he was sort of, coveting his neighbor's wife. But Joseph knew this. So, he leveraged Martin Harris with threats from God of damnation and in that little twist in there of, the neighbor's wife thing. And it ain't worked. And so Martin Harris put up his land. But the way that this is presented and strung out in the narrative we grew up on isn't really quite what happened. And it's all laid out there. But basically, about this time, Joseph started coming forth with these revelations. So D&C 24 chastises members of the church to support him financially under threat of God's curse. It's not his job to labor, and you need to support him or you're going to be damned. And then D&C 25, Emma's getting worried here because now it's 1830. I mean, she's been with Joseph for a while now. He's never had a job. He's been arrested. He's been bounced from place to place. I mean, Emma's had a rough go at this. The books didn't sell. Everything has gone wrong. And she's starting to wonder how she's going to be taken care of and who's going to pay the bills. So he busts forth D&C 25. This was after they lost their house and farm treasure digging. The debt collectors were looking for him. The Golden Bible Company wasn't working out. The Revelation says, "Do not fear for your livelihood, as Joseph will support her from the church." Because he was starting this church because the Bible, the book sales didn't work out. So later the church altered that revelation. Instead of saying from the church, it now says in the church, because that's a little softer than supporting her from the church. But again, it just shows what was actually occurring here. Samuel had just returned, and he had sold enough books to free Joseph Smith Sr. from debtor's prison. Joseph wrote his brother, and this is all in the chronology, November, December 1830. Joseph Smith wrote his brother Hiram, warning him to beware of the Freemasons. They cared more for his body than the debt. So these guys were in debt. They were in debt to their Freemason buddies and friends. They said they got a warrant. 1831, Joseph Smith revealed D&C 37, which commanded his followers to relocate to Ohio, again, Rigdon, with assurances of great riches, land of promise, endowed with power, blah, blah, blah. So it was always kind of this financial scramble that's now interwoven with the Revelations when you read them in context of what was occurring and, contracts to sell books and selling the copyrights, which, doesn't disprove anything, but, taken in greater context.
So this, just really quickly, this document says what? This
document enables Martin, I can't read his writing, but it enables Martin Harris to sell equal rights to sell the books until the printer's debt has been paid. Because Martin Harris was getting worried because this wasn't working out. And it's important to look at the context, see who was worried when and what and which discussion happened. But basically it was all about selling the books. And that's what the original participants were recording this was about creating, a story and in a book, and how it came about is just a little bit different than what we learned in Sunday school.
And that's, again, I refer people to my 14-hour interview with Chris Shelton, ex-Scientologist, great guy. You see that L. Ron Hubbard wrote all these pulp fiction books, science fiction, whatever. Then he wrote this book on Dianetics, made a killing, but then, it all kind of imploded. And then he realized, wait a minute, you can make some money off of a book and a self-help program. You can make a lot of money off of religion because you've got tax-exempt status, you've got power, you've got, you can make claims that are unfalsifiable.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting. I was going to say eerie how much L. Ron Hubbard and Joseph Smith's lives parallel each other, including starting with the book, but then moving on beyond the book. Well, when you realize that the religion is going to be much more lucrative than the book.
Well, again, it all ties together if you really dig through this stuff, and I want to get into the archaeology next. But the books remained behind in New York, and Smith moved on and partnered up with Rigdon and his communal living, and off they went. And the livelihood and the church and the sustenance. Joseph Smith parlayed a beginning of absolute poverty and debt into within 15 to 20 years, he was, one of the wealthiest men in town with land all in his name. He's the head of the militia. Now, of course, his debt really, or his wealth wasn't really all that because he had massive debt overshadowing that. But the leveraging and the growing, and so faithful members say, well, of course, he was just trying to get the church started, and it's all good and well because we had to do that to get the church off the ground. And the church itself is manifest proof that it all worked out because we're still here and the church is here. And so, it's all good. But yeah, it's all there. But I found that to be kind of an interesting episode. But you okay with that? You want to move through the archaeology real quick? So archaeology, the cabinets behind me are full of rocks. There's some fossils over here, and you've seen the other stuff in my office. I mean, we have some really fun, cool fossils and rocks and art. So archaeology was something I just hadn't really spent a lot of time thinking about in context of the Book of Mormon. And it's pretty much, I think we, in Mormons, underestimate the stakes here, what's at play. I mean, if Mormonism is true and correct, everything we know about early American history is wrong in terms of linguistics, metallurgy, agriculture, geography, DNA. I mean, take your pick, right? Either we're right and the entire known world is wrong.
Scientific world.
Right. I mean, we stand in absolute isolation. And one of the things that I'll skip ahead is my stake president got up and gave a talk after I had shared some comments in support of another member who had left. And I made some comments about how, hey, not everybody believes the same way or believes that, America was founded by a bunch of Jewish Indians on horses. The next week he got up and talked about penitence and being patient and humble and waiting. And it struck me, and it was just, the frame of mind I was in at the time. One of the most absolutely arrogant, hubris-filled things you can do is stand in total isolation, refusing to acknowledge or accept otherwise acknowledged facts while you just stand over here in the corner and wait for the world to catch up with you. And so that talk on penitence really was poor timing for me because it struck me as the least humble and the least penitent way to deal with our history is to just expect the rest of the world to catch up with us when the rest of the world has already long moved past. But again, that's archaeology is there's a long page on that. But basically, B.H. Roberts, who I had no idea, you mentioned Michael Coe. I compare it to the Roman Empire because we're familiar with that, because we've actually studied it in school and we've seen gladiator movies. But the Roman Empire, basically what's described in the Book of Mormon with Lamanites and battles with, millions. I mean, those would be the largest scale battles in the history of mankind. Not even the Civil War, not even World War II. I mean, these would be the largest battles and losses of life in human history. And the Roman Empire was of similar size, right? And if you look at Rome, you'll find coins and language and artifacts and helmets and things. I mean, it's just kind of that real world comparison. Because they had chariots and because they had shields,
armor,
right?
And
yet in the Americas, it's just complete, vacuum. So I just really had never thought about it. And for some people, they don't care. Like, well, I'm not here because it's all has to be true. I'm here because Christ and testimony. But backing all that up is this book written by a convicted treasure digger using themes and words of his day, which I acknowledge it can make us feel good. But again, my fundamental reason for believing in Mormonism is that it is true.
Yeah.
And if it's not what it claims to be, it's very hard to reconcile where you go next.
Now, apologists are going to say that, things biodegrade over time, that artifacts, there's all sorts of war artifacts and skulls that we didn't find. And so, of course, everything evaporated and eroded with history, right?
Yeah. Well, and you can believe that if you want to, right? That's why there's no Roman artifacts, because they evaporated. Yeah.
So you're saying there should be
no coins. There's no coin. There's coins and and it's all on the website. But all of these things that could and should be here simply don't exist. And I didn't know. Other people have talked about this for 100 years, and I must have missed it because, again, I've been to Tikal in Guatemala and I've climbed the ruins, and I just thought it was so awesome to envision Lamanites and in these societies and and their struggles. And I just what are we supposed to do with the Book of Mormon? We're supposed to relate it. There's a term, relate it to ourselves.
Liken it
unto ourselves. I mean, I was doing that, and yet it didn't dawn on me that the National Geographic, there's the magazines, we all read it, awesome pictures, the Smithsonian Institute. None of the guides at these places are talking about Lamanites, and the National Geographic and Smithsonian have disowned that notion. I mean, again, we stand in total isolation, and it makes it really difficult if you're pursuing truth claims to look at the archaeology. It's just really difficult. And then you get to the Hill Cumorah, which I really found fascinating. We bought the land, because it's super important hill, and we have a visitor center there, and they have a Hill Cumorah pageant where they're reenacting and talking about battles, and there's on the website confirmations and countless affirmations of prophets that is the hill, Ramah and the final battle of the Nephites and Lamanites, that little hill in New York. But if you would, John, go to, can you go to this one?
Wait, you didn't finish. That little hill in New York, what?
Well, the Hill Cumorah, it's super important.
Yeah.
So I want to show you what it actually looked like.
Okay, I will. Oh, wait, is the Day of the Lamanite Overslide. Are you going to talk about that?
Well, go there now. If it's in order, hit that one.
Okay.
But
I can come back to it. I just
let's come back to it. Let's come back to
it.
Okay.
Okay, there's the Hill Cumorah.
So I like this picture because you see the two men standing up top or whatever that is?
Yeah.
This is not a big hill. And at the time, it was treeless. So in Joseph's day, it was treeless. So we envision him running out there at night, wading through the forest and finding this, box of, stone box with plates in it. This is the hill that Joseph encountered. And this is also the hill that supposedly, this will be the largest, richest archaeology site left on planet Earth if millions of Lamanites are buried around here, right? I never thought about that.
Millions.
A sword.
Could a million people fit on that hill?
Oh, absolutely, man. Absolutely. But, then they try to move the hill. Well, it's not that hill. It's a different hill.
It's in Central America.
Well, we just don't know.
There's two Cumorahs.
Right. He wandered with the plates afterwards. We don't know where he really buried them. The battle was here, but the plates were somewhere else. I don't know. But, I look at this and it's like, really? It's just funny. As you start to look at it from a different perspective, again, if truth matters, it's really hard to stick 2 million Lamanites on this hill. And the church has stopped talking about it. That's what this chart shows, that the church has pretty much abandoned the Lamanite generation of discussing Lamanites. That was...
So tell us what this chart shows.
This chart shows how often Lamanites are referenced in conference.
And the peak is in the 1950s, where it's 45 times in the general conferences in the 1950s, right?
Yeah, and then DNA kind of became a thing, and it just went like crickets in the 90s.
George P. Lee's excommunicated, and then DNA studies, and all of a sudden, no more mention I call this the incredible shrinking Lamanites.
We don't, what stays in Lamanite land, we don't talk about it. But yeah, it basically went from this major push. And this was the Indian, what do we call it? Where we would adopt Lamanite children and bring them to the States. Lamanite placement program.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a period when we were actively trying to bring Lamanite kids into white Mormon families.
To make them blossom like a rose, to make the dark and loathsome skin turn white and delightsome.
That was a byproduct, but to redeem the Lamanites and bring them back to the white.
And this is a point Brett Metcalf made in my interview with him. Nowadays Mormons are like, who cares, Lamanites?
Right.
Like, okay.
Yeah. That was never the basis of my faith.
But the problem is that if you read the title page of the Book of Mormon, that's the whole reason the Book of Mormon was written. If you look at the first and foremost in the title page, the Book of Mormon was written to convert the pure blood of Israel, the Lamanites, back to the true gospel of Jesus Christ.
Which, coincidentally enough, is exactly what they were doing in 1830.
Yeah, and so if the primary audience for whom the Book of Mormon was restored now no longer can be found and is hidden and not discussed, it begs the question, why was the book ever originally created for them?
Right. And what's the purpose?
And it turns out, again, this goes to just, do Lamanites even exist? If they all descend from Asia, from Mongolia, and there is no genetic tie to anyone in Middle East, then again, and it's not just any one of these things.
Right.
Okay, yeah, a faithful BYU geneticist who's on the payroll can explain away the DNA problem, but it's not just the DNA problem. It's the archaeology problem.
No one else is arguing that.
It's Joseph's credibility. It's the polygamy and the Book of Abraham and just all these things piled up.
Yeah,
it's like, how much evidence?
Oh, we haven't even got to the Book of Abraham yet.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and we did have. It's worth mentioning. Wasn't it Simon who edited the DNA essay?
Simon Southerton.
Yeah. So we did have some credible help there in fact checking and making sure that the DNA essay holds up to some degree of actual scientific scrutiny. You know what I mean?
So on the Truth Claims website, there is a DNA.
Yeah.
There's a DNA essay.
Yeah.
And by the way, to get the Book of Mormon stuff, you have to go to the books. So it's Truth Claims, then it's the books, then it's Book of Mormon, and then under that, you have all the different essays on the Book of Mormon.
Well, and I think it's I don't know, problematic. Do you have the slide where there's countless references, but this is a letter from the First Presidency confirming the location of Hill Cumorah in New York. I mean, it's hardly worth mentioning.
No, it is.
There's so many. There's so many.
I'll show it now. So talk about it.
Well, there's just apologetics try to move the hill, and I just.
So this is a letter on church stationery by F. Michael Watson, who was the secretary to the First Presidency. This Bishop Darrell Brooks writes in from Oklahoma in 1990, saying, "Hey, tell me what's the deal with the Hills Cumorah?
Is it really that? I mean, people have been asking this question all the way back through B.H. Roberts' time and before, but the church has long maintained, as attested by references in the writings of its general authorities, that the Hill Cumorah in western New York State is the same one referenced in the Book of Mormon. And there's countless other references from prophets validating that hill. And again, I think it's just one of the most tangible, if you're interested in confirming, if that's important to you, that the historicity be factual, the Hill Cumorah is just a beautiful place to start.
So the Hill Cumorah is the Hill Cumorah.
Right.
And if that's true, where are the swords and the helmets and the shields and the bones?
Or anything,
And how is it not big enough to even fit?
Well, and I think a lot of Mormons, if you live in Idaho and Utah and some of these places, they're familiar with hunting, right? And if you've ever hunted an animal, you'll know they're pretty fast and it's really hard to catch them. And so if you envision a couple million warriors plus, right, their families, I think. Either way, start with 2 million and do what you want with that. And and let's grant them swords, right? Even though they really didn't have swords, but let's just pretend they had swords and arrows. and you're going to feed a population of 2 million plus people running around with swords and arrows, you will have scared off every squirrel, every rabbit, every deer, every whatever you can find. And there's no pigs, there's no horses, there's no cows. Any game to feed that massive population. I mean, just again, it's silly to talk about it.
Bison.
Great.
Except the Book of Mormon doesn't mention bison.
And those were in the plains, but yeah,
I don't think
either
it
way.
bison. Does the Book of Mormon mention bison?
I don't know. I don't believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, but those would be good. Those are good eating. But still, you've got to chase it and catch it to feed 2 million people a week.
If the soldiers are fighting in battle, who's actually killing and preparing the food for the soldiers?
When I really paused to think about it, I was kind of like, okay, but anyway. You want to move on to the witnesses?
Sure.
Okay. So this is also very important in terms of credibility, right? I mean, if you're going to witness something and you're going to stand behind it, and if you go through the problem of even bothering to get witnesses in the first place, you might just want to make sure they're credible and that you hold on to whatever it is they witnessed. So in brief, there was no date, there's no location of when they saw, where they saw, which again by itself does not disprove anything. But if you have to look at what else they saw and how believable or unbelievable or contradictory it was. But they're all related, with the exception of there's 2 families.
All the witnesses, the Whitmers and the Smiths, basically, right?
There you go. 2 families, Whitmers and the Smith, except for Martin Harris. And Martin Harris is his own special witness, which we'll get into. None of them recorded it in their own contemporary writing. It looks like they signed some statement Joseph Smith produced, but really they didn't sign it. Because
you want to show that picture?
Pull up the slides there. And again, maybe they signed it at some point, but the ones that we were all shown growing up, I don't know if this used to be in the Book of Mormon, but I definitely know growing up I saw these signatures prominently promoted. Well, this is Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. So Oliver Cowdery scribed and wrote every witness signature that was previously, put out as the witness signatures, but these are not their signatures. That I did not know.
So what does that matter that they didn't sign the document?
Or
how might it matter?
Well, and then in the end, Joseph Smith buried it all under a rock and destroyed it. And, so we don't know when and where they did it. It just all adds up. It's just every piece of this just gets weaker and weaker as I looked at it.
Yeah, why would somebody, if you just think about it, why would I sign someone else's signature?
Yeah. Well, and why would you bother?
You could list them. You could say these were the witnesses.
Right.
But why sign signatures for other people? Now,
and they never spoke about it. They never talked about it.
I'm sure Oliver Cowdery was smart enough to know that others could see that it was his handwriting.
Right.
So I don't know if that was just commonly done back then, or people would sign for other people.
I don't know.
But it's fishy.
Well, I know that to me this was presented as witness signatures.
Yeah.
Did this used to be in the cover of the Book of Mormon or something?
Absolutely.
I've seen this.
Yeah.
And this was presented to me as witnesses signing, and then they never denied their testimonies. But the fact of the matter is that Joseph Smith later got dozens of his followers to sign their names and oath to false statements regarding polygamy, lying about that they're not practicing it and they have no idea what you're talking about. The Relief Society presidencies signed things that were not true. So there's a history here of devoted followers flat out lying. And then you add this to the visionary state with which these witnesses witness things.
Spiritual eyes.
The spiritual eyes. I mean, you can read about that. And
that's called, and Grant Palmer did a great job talking about this in Insider's View of Mormon Origins. God secularism rest his soul. He's passed away as well. But if you go back and read his book or listen to my Mormon Stories interviews, this was a common thing. It was called second sight.
Right.
And it goes along with this folk magic where, you didn't see God or see Jesus or see angels with your real eyes, but who knows what visions and spiritual things you can see in your mind's eye, in your spiritual brain or eyes.
Right.
And the witnesses, admitted that when they saw the plates and when they saw the angel, it was with their spiritual eyes. In other words, with their imagination, right?
Well, and Mormon scripture further validates this. D&C 17:5 says, by faith, the 3 witnesses will see the plates. Well, if they're real plates, why do you need faith to see them? I don't need faith to see the table, because it's a table, right? And so, and then First Nephi 8:2, behold, I have dreamed a dream. In other words, I have seen a vision.
Right.
That's literally, dreams, visions, what's the difference? And notice they call it the first vision. They don't call it the first visitation. They call it the first vision. Because,
Right.
What did he vision or see?
Did Joseph really see God and Jesus, or did he have a dream
it?
about
Did he imagine
God and
it?
Jesus?
Right. And did he not mention it? But yeah, how they saw and why you need faith to see tangible things, because, the plates apparently could have been delivered and then taken and then returned. The angel can just bring these things at will, right? And Joseph told a story later of how he ran through the woods when he discovered the plates, and was, chased and attacked and beat off attackers, and ran 3 miles with carrying, 200 pounds of golden plates, or whatever weight you ascribe to them. I mean, the running with gold plate story was kind of entertaining.
I mean, it fits kind of this Arnold Freeberg sort of like folklore, like Joseph Smith was like Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill. And
Yeah, you'd need to be.
But if Sandra Tanner has, and I interviewed Sandra Tanner on Mormon Stories, she's got a copy of, plates about the size that they would have been,
right?
Not from gold,
and we know
but
the
from
size,
an inferior metal that's actually lighter,
right?
And I'm a big guy. I'm 6'6". I lift weights. I'm not like a beefcake.
Run through the woods with that.
I try to even just pick up these things and just walk in a circle around the table, and I could barely make it. How is this guy like a Heisman Trophy winner?
Fighting off attackers.
Sprinting with the plates in one arm, beating back attackers.
Well, why would it have mattered? Because if you look upon them, you can't look upon them without dying anyway, because you have the purity. Why don't you just show it to them and your attackers will die? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But, John Whitmer, he said they were shown to me by supernatural power. Martin Harris admitted under oath that, he saw them as he saw, a city through the mountain. But, so it's all there. And David Whitmer, he had his own seer stone before and had visionary experiences. I'm going to read this one. This is Lyndon Cook. He's a teacher of church history and doctrine at BYU. And he suggested that Whitmer was one of the most visionary of the clan. He said, Whitmer's accounts of other supernatural experiences must be seen in connection with the more frequently printed evidence to fully I understand this witness's testimony, right? Whatever he said there. I mean, basically, David Whitmer's account changed over time and it contradicted. And, when did he see it? Was it 3 days later? Was there a sword of Laban? Was there a ball? I mean, he just threw all kinds of stuff out there at different times. And there was the ball and the sword and no one else mentioned balls and swords, and so it was almost like a one-upsmanship with him of what he saw and how spiritual he was. But anyway, it just goes on and on. Mark Twain, I love Mark Twain. I didn't know his role during this time period until I read this stuff. He's the one that quipped regarding the whole Whitmer.
It's a great quote.
I could not feel more satisfied and at rest if the entire Whitmer family had testified. It just speaks to the ridicule that these people were under even in their own day.
Well, because in Mormon lore, these names, Whitmer and Cowdery and Rigdon and Harris, they're sacred.
These are the founders, man.
So to us, it's like Jesus and Peter and Paul and Mary. Yeah. But to the average, U.S. citizen, these were kind of bumpkins. These were yokels. These were just kooks. And they weren't just, they were running around trying to find buried treasure in hills, sacrificing chickens and goats to try and like these were people that were very superstitious, not well educated. Right. Very gullible people.
Yeah. And I would say I like these two slides. Can you go to these real quick? Or did you go to So the first one shows, I'm going to hold up, these very, here's the board of directors standing around the plates, right? Very credible men in suits.
Right.
Right. Okay. I mean, of course. I mean, this fits a Mormon profile of what witnesses should be wearing, and they all look
like it's like the founding fathers. It's it's like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin.
This is faith inspiring.
They're all bow ties and ruffled white shirts.
They're heading out in the woods to see the plates, man.
Clean cut,
and they're touching them with their hands. Okay, and then go to the next slide. Do you have Martin Harris? Okay. He married his cousin. He saw all sorts of things.
His hair's kind of messed up.
I'm not picking on this old guy's appearance,
but scruffy little beard going on.
Kind of am like
his bow tie's kind of like his bow tie's a little janky.
I know.
So we've got kind of like
I love the married your cousin part. That's just awesome.
What?
He married his cousin.
Oh yeah. So the
not that doesn't make it true.
Beautiful visuals versus the actual visuals.
Right.
It's a nice visual. And for those of you listening, sorry you can't see the differences, but it's worth jumping to the YouTube video or the Facebook video just to see the difference.
Well, and then we take faith in that they never denied their witness. Well, a few in particular, like Martin Harris, never denied their witness of Shakerism and the 6 or 8 other religions, he'd come in and out of before and after Mormonism. And he testified of a great many things after Mormonism. And, it's
super important that Martin Harris followed James Strang after Joseph Smith, who also claimed to produce his own scripture.
All the Whitmers did.
And they're all following James Strang after Joseph died, and testifying to the truthfulness of James Strang's books.
Which ironically took his people to his own little private island and started practicing polygamy and was killed by his followers. But all the Whitmers, and the Living Smiths aligned with Strang's for a while, and he made his own fake plates. Anyway, it's just
also it's important to talk about Whitmer, because Whitmer puts out a pamphlet after he kind of leaves the movement, And to get to the priesthood restoration, that should come. But he basically says, we say that they never denied their testimony to the Book of Mormon. That may be technically true, but they did explicitly say that some of the things Joseph later taught were not part of what they experienced, and so they must have been imposed later. So there is a break in witness / testimony.
Yeah. When they vacated the scene, when Joseph started altering the revelations too, I mean, that was Whitmer Harris was real big on the alterations and claiming more authority, and all things were written until they weren't, and then Joseph wrote more. I mean, there was a lot there. But why don't we do the priesthood?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so priesthood to me,
this is huge.
This is everything, man. This is it. I mean, this is game time, and it's either a thing or it's not.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm gonna suggest this. I'm gonna start with this before we get into the history of what was altered when, and did they see it, and do we know when and where. I'm gonna offer this example, because I was talking with my bishop when I was going through my truth crisis, and we were talking, and he's a great guy, and he does have a nuanced view, without putting too many words in his mouth that he probably won't want me to put in, but he understands the issues, and we would have some good lunches and conversations, and he's a very educated, he's basically a corporate tax attorney who's a pretty sharp guy. So he knows how to read and critically think. But there was this conversation we were having, and I put forth this example of ponder healthcare, not just in the United States, but around the world. If you could, you're talking about trillions of dollars at play. Pharmaceutical industry, insurance companies, hospital, Medicare. I mean, you're talking about the entire food chain of the medical system and the healthcare delivery system and the insurance system and the financial system trading it. If you could move the needle, if you could alter healthcare outcomes, even a fraction, you're talking about massive, massive profits. And so we now live in the age of data where you can sort of track a few things, and some of this people just write off as, well, we never really said we're healing. It's more of a comforting. But I was raised to think that the priesthood had awesome power, and the power to heal and to give priesthood blessings. You got to consecrate the olive oil, and you got to rub it on their head, and you got to give a blessing. And we've all seen things. People say, I've seen things, and I had seen things too. But I'm just gonna ask, is it realistic that the Mormon priesthood has healing powers? Could we see it in these counties in Utah and pockets of Idaho that are 90% Mormon? How many priesthood blessings are healing the sick? Would it not show up in the Medicare stats and the healthcare? It's all tracked to the nth degree, because there's huge money at stake here. So the real world test of, does Mormon authority priesthood heal? I had never thought about that. I had never thought. And the money and the power at stake, if you could move the needle at all, they'd be preaching it from every corner with the missionaries, this awesome power of Mormon priesthood. So what does it do? If it can't heal people, if there's absolutely no efficacy in some of these things that it's supposed to do, what does it do? And that goes back to the authority claims. So we're stuck basically with Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery not knowing where it occurred, somewhere along the banks of the river.
Okay, wait. So back up. So we do celebrate the anniversary of the Aaronic priesthood, right?
Well, we don't know when Peter, James, and John appeared.
Okay, so to give a little more background. So the traditional understanding is what?
Well, Peter, James, and John appeared to...
first John the Baptist, right?
Okay, yeah.
John the Baptist appears to Joseph and what?
Well,
confers the Aaronic priesthood on him, right?
I guess.
No?
Yeah, sure. Let's go with that.
That's the Aaronic priesthood. Well, you've studied all this stuff. Come on, man.
Yeah, but Peter, James, and John along the banks of the Susquehanna one night somewhere.
That's the Melchizedek priesthood,
Well, that's all that matters.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, because that's the sealing power. Well, why do you say that's all that matters?
Well, it's Melchizedek.
Right. Aaronic is just like bless the sacrament, pass the sacrament.
Let's just stay focused on the Melchizedek for a minute.
Okay. So the Melchizedek. But the Aaronic priesthood, there is some claim for dates, and there is some claim that something happened.
Well, but the real one is Melchizedek priesthood.
And yeah. So now tell us.
So we don't know. They don't know when it occurred.
It's not
We
written.
don't know where it
anywhere.
occurred, and no one heard about it for 5 years. So 5 years later.
And this is where Whitmer's like, hey, wait a minute, where did that come from?
Yeah.
Well, there was no talk of a Melchizedek priesthood when I was hanging around Joseph Smith and was part of the movement.
It's like the first vision. No one had heard about it until years later when they were in trouble, authorities being challenged, and Joseph Smith busts out this, and I have this special authority restored to me that I haven't mentioned in 5 years, but here it is.
Right.
So again, it all goes to this timing and credibility, and then there's a whole chronology in there too of things that should have, could have, would have been mentioned, but they weren't mentioned. And so on the priesthood page itself, that essay has a chronology focused on the priesthood you can look at. And David Whitmer said, I never heard that an angel had ordained Joseph and Oliver to the Aaronic priesthood until the year 1834, 5, or 6. I do not believe that John the Baptist ever ordained Joseph and Oliver. David Whitmer hadn't heard about it. But these were the years where they were throwing the witnesses under the bus because they had apostatized and they couldn't be trusted anyway. So he was just bitter. But the original contemporary participants had never heard anything about this.
Yeah, so it appears as though the Melchizedek priesthood, and again, Grant Palmer talks about this as well, the Melchizedek priesthood was invented later in response to debates about authority, but also as Joseph Smith was trying to salvage this massive defection, store up his power, and resolve debates and questions that people were having.
Well, wasn't this the Fanny Alger years? This was the first nanny gate, wasn't this?
So yeah,
around
there
that
are
time?
claims about Joseph having
affair,
cheating on Emma, having an
yeah.
affair with someone who's living in his house,
Right.
And so some of these big revelations, these big doctrinal things, come years later than we thought, without any written evidence of them ever happening.
Yeah.
In an apparent attempt of Joseph to salvage his reputation and not have everything fall apart.
Can you go to this slide?
Yeah. Start talking about it.
This slide we're going to bring up is one of the absolute most important things I ever saw. Because, we're dancing around who did or didn't know when and what, occurred, and John the Baptist did or didn't appear. But again, let's go back to the actual original LDS materials. Let's go back to our own scriptures, the Book of Commandments, the Doctrine and Covenants. I believe this came from Sandra Tanner's site. I think this was their stuff. So again, I want to give credit where credit is due. So this was let me just look at the notes here. So in 1833, in the Book of Commandments, a compilation of revelations to that date, it contained basically this, and the chapters and verses have changed, but it's all on the website. This chapter 60, whatever this is, of the Book of Commandments was just this big. It was this little couple paragraphs about sacrament wine, and it's a completely mundane paragraph. Well, by the time this turns into the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835, I think it's is it 440 words? Anyway, all of this material was suddenly added, and it just appeared out of nowhere. So this words added, words deleted, all of this stuff was added and inserted into previously canonized scripture and revelations. This is the entire priesthood restoration of Mormonism. There's no scribe notes, there's no journal entries, there's no minutes, there's no discussion. Absolutely
and no awareness.
Unheard of.
No awareness of Joseph's contemporaries. Right.
Absolutely.
Like the three witnesses, right?
Totally
They're like,
unheard
wait, I never heard about that.
Until this stuff gets inserted 5 years later. And it literally, he just put it in between the lines. And it was, and I saw Peter and James and John. I mean, so this is unbelievable for me to see how he just backs up and writes it in. He just literally inserted it out of nowhere. So Richard Bushman in Rough Stone Rolling, page 75, the late appearance of these accounts raises the possibility of later fabrication. Okay, this is like the most faithful version, and the guy, Richard Bushman, is saying that it raises the possibility of later fabrication. It's things like this that even the apologists have a really hard time getting around. But I just apply the real-world efficacy test to the priesthood and see if it has any power at all. It should show up in the healing rates of blessings. Because isn't that part of what it's for?
Yeah.
The healing?
Yeah.
Because I was taught when I was a young man that I had more power in the tip of my finger with the priesthood and be respectful of it, but it's also authority. A big thing is we're the one true church. Right.
Other churches aren't.
Right.
What's the difference between us and them? We've got the keys. We've got the authority.
Authority to do what?
So it's not just healing.
Yeah.
No, it's authority to exist. It's like the franchise. It's not just the authority to heal.
Yeah.
It's like the McDonald's imprimatur, right? It's like the stamp. It's the king's seal.
Right.
Right. We're the true. We're not the imitation.
Yeah.
We're not the fake stuff. We've got God's channeling and permission.
And this is where you go to the chronology as well, just like the first vision. And there's a few prominent points. 1833, Joseph Knight wrote a history of important events in Mormonism. You'd think Peter, James, and John would have been on that list. There's no mention of any priesthood restoration. November 1833, that was Mormonism Unveiled. That totally anti-Mormon thing. Absolutely no mention of Peter, James, and John restoration. For first vision, we already covered that. But even Oliver Cowdery, in 1834, he wrote the first official church history. Don't you think the priesthood restoration would have been kind of important? So again, it's in the chronology. It's what's missing that I think spoke very powerfully to. It's the bottom button on the left-hand side.
Keep going.
All right. It speaks. What's not there is equal or of greater importance than what was there. And then also you get to the difference between Elijah and Elias, where Joseph Smith just didn't really recognize that they're the same person, but one was the Greek name. So when Joseph's recounting who appeared to him in the histories, he mentioned them as two different people appearing to him, when in fact Elias and Elijah are the same person referenced in the Bible. Just one's a Greek name.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And again, all of these points are in the essay on the priesthood restoration, found on the Mormon Stories website under Truth Claims. This one's under Mormon doctrine and then priesthood restoration.
Yeah, it's under doctrine. So actually, as our son was turning 12 and we were attending the priesthood prep classes, right? This was there are a few of these salient moments that in hindsight we can look back on. We were at the stake center, and the stake president was there, the bishop was there, all the authorities were there, and we were having a gathering for the soon to be deacons that were going to be turning 12. And one of the young men got up to talk, and he talked about his excitement to receive the priesthood and the special power of protection that was going to afford him. And it was one of those silent moments where I just kind of sat and just didn't say a word, but I sort of just looked at my wife. Are you hearing this? And it was, we were deep enough into it at that point that it really started to resonate with us, what was going on. And nobody stepped up to correct this child, this young man. So we've instilled this notion of special powers of protection and special powers of healing and special powers and authority. And it's something that we have a hard time with now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like you said, priesthood is kind of the show. It's kind of what makes us different. And who knew that it was just deeply problematic.
Right.
And
just the appearance of it and just writing it into scripture like that. I found that just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.